Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and sketch out one of the absolute most catastrophic societal collapses in ancient history. We're looking at the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This is that intense historical moment where the literally unstoppable force of the Roman Empire collided head-on with the immovable resolve of Judean rebels. It's a story packed with military genius, just unimaginable suffering, and it marks a massive turning point in world history.
But before we even map out the military tactics or geek out over the Roman engineering, we really need to ground ourselves in the sheer human terror of this event. Because at the time, Jerusalem was celebrated by Roman authors like Pliny the Elder as by far the most famous city of the East, and yet it was ultimately consumed by fire and iron. The historian Flavius Josephus actually witnessed this firsthand, and he wrote that the agony of the people trapped inside was so immense that, quote, the silence of hunger hung over the city like a shroud.
Part 1. The Seeds of Revolt.
You see, the sparks that ignited this apocalypse began decades before the siege even started. Tension had been simmering for years under Roman procurators who completely misunderstood or just disrespected Jewish cultural sensitivities. Then, in 66 AD, a Roman procurator seized 17 talents of gold straight from the temple, claiming it was for unpaid taxes, and then massacred the protesting citizens. Well, that sparked a massive insurrection. Rome sent in a legion to fix it, but incredibly, the Judean forces ambushed and routed them at Beth Horon. It was a massive, humiliating defeat for Rome. And Rome, they don't take humiliation lightly. They responded by sending their seasoned general Vespasian, who spent 3 years waging a methodical, scorched earth campaign, driving refugees straight into Jerusalem's walls. By 70 AD, Vespasian had become emperor, so he left his 29-year-old son Titus to finish the job.
That brings us to part 2, a fortress divided. When Titus finally marched his 50,000 men up to the gates of Jerusalem, he was looking at an absolute geographical and architectural nightmare. His troops had to approach from the flat north, which meant cutting through 3 massive walls. And we're talking perfectly fitted, massive stone ashlar blocks specifically designed to absorb the impact of a battering ram. At the heart of all this was the Temple Mount, which was basically a massive artificial plateau functioning like a fortress within a fortress, completely overseen by the towering Antonia fortress.
But here is the fatal flaw, and honestly, the true tragedy of Jerusalem. Instead of uniting against the Romans, the city was actively ripping itself apart from the inside. The rebel leadership had splintered into 3 warring factions. You had John of Dishkala holding the outer temple, Simon Bar Jura controlling the upper city, and Eleazar ben Simon barricaded inside the inner temple sanctuary. They were literally fighting bloody street battles against each other right up until the Romans knocked on the front door. Just contrast that for a second. Outside the walls, the cold, methodical discipline of the Roman war machine, 50,000 seasoned troops. Inside the walls, the tragic self-sabotage of the rebels. In a desperate bid to deny resources to one another, these rebel factions actually set fire to the city's vast granaries. They burned years' worth of grain, oil, and salt just out of sheer spite. They essentially condemned their own people to starvation before the Romans even fired a single catapult. Let's move to part 3, the Roman stranglehold. Facing these insane defenses, Titus decided on a strategy of complete, inescapable starvation. To make absolutely sure no one could escape and nothing could be smuggled in, the legions built a continuous 5-mile-long siege wall entirely around the city. And get this, they built it in just 3 days. To pull that off, they stripped the surrounding hills bare of every single tree for a 10-mile radius. A lush landscape was just turned into a desolate wasteland overnight. And to break the defenders' spirits, Titus unleashed systematic psychological terror. Desperate civilians who tried sneaking out at night just to forage for wild herbs in the ravines were captured by Roman patrols, and the Romans crucified up to 500 people a day right in full view of the city walls. They created this grotesque forest of crosses covering the hillsides until they literally ran out of wood. Now, the history of this siege is super dense with military maneuvers, but we have to pause here to acknowledge the horrifying human reality of this famine. Josephus recorded the tragedy of a wealthy woman named Mary of Bethsazuba, driven completely to insanity by the agonizing starvation after rebels looted her home. She committed an unthinkable act of cannibalism against her own infant son. When the rebel forces discovered what she had done, even these hardened killers fled in horror. That moment really signaled that hunger had completely shattered the bounds of human civilization inside those walls.
Part 4, breaching the walls. With the city starving and severely weakened, Roman engineering crews brought out the big guns. Enter Nico, or the Conqueror. This was a massive battering ram housed inside a towering wooden structure, completely draped in wet hides to protect it from flaming arrows. While Nico went to work, Roman artillery was hurling 75-pound painted boulders over the walls. The defenders' watchmen would cry out warnings when they saw the white stones coming, so the Romans cleverly just painted the stones black to make them invisible against the night sky, while Nico systematically pounded the ashlar stones. This relentless dismantling moved incredibly fast. Step 1, Nico shatters the third wall. Days later, Step 2, the second wall is breached and demolished. For Step 3, the Romans built massive timber ramps against the Antonia fortress, but the rebels actually tunneled underneath and burned them from below in this roaring subterranean fire. But the Romans adapted quickly. Step 4, a small Roman strike force launches a stealth night attack, scales the damaged walls, captures the fortress, and demolishes it, which creates a broad ramp directly to the Temple Mount. Which brings us to Part 5, Fall of the Temple. By August of 70 AD, the savage, hand-to-hand fighting spilled directly onto the polished marble floors of the Second Temple. Titus and his war council allegedly debated whether or not to spare this magnificent architectural wonder, but the chaos of battle made the decision for them. During a skirmish, a Roman soldier threw a burning brand right through a gilded window. The dry wood and ancient tapestries ignited instantly. And despite Titus's orders to put out the flames, the Roman legionaries were so consumed by bloodlust they completely ignored him. The sanctuary became a roaring furnace. The gold plating melted right into the cracks of the stone floor, which literally prompted the Romans to pry the structure apart, stone by stone, to scavenge for the gold, fulfilling the phrase of leaving not one stone upon another. When the final rebel holdouts in the upper city were overrun, the scale of the slaughter was just staggering. Josephus recorded over 1.1 million dead and 97,000 enslaved. Now, while modern historians might debate those exact numbers, everyone agrees the toll was immense. The streets were filled with victims of the famine, and the Roman soldiers put so many to the sword that their blood reportedly extinguished some of the fires still burning in the city.
Finally, Part 6, The Legacy of Ruin.
As the smoke cleared, this catastrophe created historical ripple effects that changed the world forever. For the Jewish people, the destruction of the temple ended the sacrificial system, but it birthed the emergence of rabbinic Judaism, which centered on Torah study and the synagogue, allowing their identity to survive the diaspora. And simultaneously, for Rome, this massive victory secured the new Flavian dynasty. The immense spoils plundered from the temple treasury were brought back to Rome and used to fund massive public works, most notably the Flavian Amphitheater, which we all know today as the Colosseum. When you put this in context and compare this scale of brutality in Jerusalem to, say, Alexander the Great's siege of Tyre or the complete destruction of Carthage, Jerusalem really stands out. The devastating combination of extreme famine, systematic mass crucifixion, and that bitter internal civil war cements it as perhaps the darkest and most devastating chapter of ancient warfare. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a really provocative thought about the tragic intersection of external ambition and internal self-sabotage. Looking at the evidence we just walked through, what truly brings down a great civilization? Is it the undeniable, heavily armed force battering at the gates? Or is it the fatal, irreconcilable divisions festering within the walls long before the enemy even arrives? Keep that in mind as you look at history. Thanks for diving into this with me.
Please like and subscribe.